Okay, it's just past 1 o'clock and we'll start our lecture, A Monstrous Regiment of Women, Queenship in Early Modern England. And first of all, let me say a big thank you to all of you who are attending this lecture today. I'm Maurice Howard and an art historian, and I'm a former officer of the Society. Let me just say a few words about the Society before we begin. The Society of Antiquaries lives in its apartments in Burlington House in Piccadilly. We were founded in 1707 by an informal meeting of scholars who were interested in the material remains of Britain. We gained a royal charter in 1751 under George II, and at that time took on rooms in Somerset House, where we housed a growing collection of objects, where we also had some pictures there, and meetings and debates were held. We moved to the present site on Burlington House in 1874, where we continue to focus on fellowship, conservation, and research, and in that modern means of parlance, on dissemination. And dissemination means that we offer public lectures, online resources, a library which welcomes all scholars with their inquiries. We have items from our collections on loan in exhibitions, and indeed many hundreds of works on permanent loan in museums and galleries up and down the United Kingdom. We also give funds for research, for conservation, for projects not only in Britain, but in many parts of the world, and particularly with our long-standing connections to research and archaeology in the Middle East. We'll have a question and answer session at the end. So during our speaker's talk, if you'd like to put your questions in the chat box, I will monitor that, and I will make sure that I get through as many questions as possible, not tiring our speaker too much, a short time for questions. And I will also bunch some questions together, because there are certainly going to be people who are asking some of the same sorts of things. This is the fourth lecture in our series celebrating our online exhibition, Henry VIII, Defender of the Faith. It's this year being the 500th anniversary of that title being given to Henry VIII by Pope Leo X. This exhibition showcases our portraits, manuscripts, books, and objects in the collection to explore the public and private life of the king. How and why this title, Defender of the Faith, was conferred on him, and how he became an adversary of the established Church of Rome in the later 1520s. We're interested and we're curious as to how the title of Defender was then restored and retained under his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, and one aspect of the lecture we're going to hear today. Our speaker is Susan Doran, who is Professor of Early Modern History at the University of Oxford and Senior Research Fellow at Jesus College and St. Benet's Hall. She has written extensively on the Tudors and especially on Elizabeth I, her image, her religion, her political relationships, her attitudes to marriage and foreign policy. She has also edited catalogues for major exhibitions on the Tudors, and about to happen, very exciting, Elizabeth and Mary, royal cousins, rival queens, to open at the British Library in October 2021, so absolutely imminent, hot off the press. At present, she is completing a book entitled Regime Change from Elizabeth I to James I, 1603 to 12, for Oxford University Press. So, Susan, with that, over to you, and we look forward to your lecture.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming. My lecture today is on Queenship, and it has the main title, A Monstrous Regiment of Women. Now, as we all know, England had 2 or possibly even 3 queens during the 50 years from 1553 to 1603, 3 queens if we include Lady Jane Grey. Yet in the patriarchal society of England in the 16th century, queenship was in many ways unthinkable. And it was in the words of the Scottish Protestant John Knox that female rule was called a monstrous regiment. Regiment, of course, meaning rule, and monstrous not just meaning in the American sense, this is monstrous, but meaning like a monster, unnatural, something that was subversive and inversive. Now, this was not an unusual attitude. So one of the things I'm going to explore is how come two women took the throne, and I will argue ruled pretty successfully. Now, of course, it's Henry VIII that you're celebrating in the exhibition. So I just want to begin by making the point that Henry VIII was so opposed to the notion of female rule that he worked to get a son. And one could argue, I think quite legitimately, that the Reformation in England resulted from his determination to avoid female rule. But it wasn't just Henry in his kingship that wanted to prevent a female taking the throne. His son, Edward VI, of course, also saw dangers in female rule. I'm not convinced entirely that his opposition to his two sisters was solely on the basis of their gender, though it would seem to be initially their gender that led him to try and get a male on the throne. You can see in the device, this is the device for the succession, which he drafted, we're not quite sure when, but during his last illness, and probably in the spring of 1553. There he makes it absolutely clear that those that he wants are to be male heirs. They're first of all of his cousin, Frances, the mother of Lady Jane Grey, and then to the Lady Jane Grey's heirs male, and then to her sister Catherine's son. So the aim was to get a male on the throne. Of course, that didn't happen, and it was Lady Jane Grey that was proclaimed, and we can see here a picture of her from the National Portrait Gallery, but also her proclamation, which is in the Society of Antiquaries. It didn't happen because the illness of Edward VI was so speedy. It ran away much more quickly than his advisors and he himself thought. And Lady Jane Grey barely had time to get married, let alone produce a son. And the same was true for her mother, who was married, but was beyond really the age where it was likely she would become pregnant quickly. So a female did actually appear on the throne. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, and then afterwards, of course, Mary. I would argue, though, that real concern of Edward was the religion of Mary, and he wanted to do what he could to prevent a Catholic sitting on the throne. And as far as Elizabeth was concerned, the danger was that as an unmarried woman, she might marry a Catholic who would then restore England to the Roman Church. So it's important that he focused on gender, and it was important because this meant that he thought that it would have a resonance in the country. But I think the underlying reason for him was that female rule would only be dangerous if it was Catholic rule. Now, the opposition to female rule really became fully formed during the reign of Mary. Again, the question arises as whether or not the deep-seated opposition to Mary was because of her gender or whether it was because of her religion. As far as John Knox was concerned, I don't think the two could be separated. But Christopher Goodman, who also wrote against female rule, did make it clear in his writings that if a woman saw sense and undertook the true religion, then an exception could be made. And of course, John Knox will pick this up later on. But let's just look at the arguments that John Knox produced in opposition to female rule. The most important one is that female rule was against God's will. And he went back to Genesis, that Eve was, of course, created in the story from Adam's rib. She was secondary, but still more important, after original sin, after biting of the apple and seducing Adam, one could say, into biting the apple. Her punishment was not only the pains of childbirth, which quite honestly were punishment enough, but also that she would have to be, and all women who succeeded her would have to be subservient to men. So that kind of injunction went right back to the beginning of the Bible. But in addition, God's will could be seen in the animal kingdom, because arguing from Aristotle as well as his own observation, John Knox pointed out that it was the male animal that was always dominant within the natural world. Other arguments that he put forward, one or two are well worth referring to. The first is that in his experience and through writing history, women's characteristics made them unsuitable for rule. They were weak, they were foolish, they were inconstant, they were without judgment, they were not rational, they were emotional. All these characteristics would not make for a good ruler. And then, again, women were intended to be, in the words of St. Paul, silent and chaste. And silence was certainly not a characteristic that one wanted from a king. So to sum up, and almost in the words of 1066 and all that, a good queen would be a bad woman, and conversely, a good woman would be a bad queen. Now, arguments had therefore to be found that would justify female rule, and they were not slow in coming forward, particularly from another group of Protestants when Elizabeth succeeded to the throne. The two main arguments can be summarized as providentialism and the king or the queen's two bodies. Providentialism again looked back at the Bible, and it was argued that through the Bible, one could see instances of God's will being carried out through those least expected to do so. People who were either weak or disabled or female. And the two main examples that are brought out in Elizabeth's reign were the examples of David, King David, the great Old Testament king who had started off life as the youngest in his family and as a poor shepherd boy. So Elizabeth was being, during her reign, is very often compared to David for this very reason. And then there is, of course, the judge Deborah, that is the image that is closely allied to Elizabeth during the early years of her reign and her coronation pageant, most obviously, but in other writings too. Here was a woman judge who was so important in encouraging the attack on idolatry and getting her general to take up arms against the Canaanite idolaters. And of course, for Protestants, the Canaanite idolaters were Catholics. So from the providential point of view, Elizabeth could be justified as a monarch, particularly if, like Deborah, she was to take the advice of men and use men as her instruments to carry through God's work. But the other argument was older in origin. I'm not older than the Bible, obviously, but older in terms of its use in being applied to constitutional matters. And that was the king's two bodies. And that was the division between the natural body of a monarch and what one would call, though it wasn't actually put that way, the institution of monarchy. And it was therefore that the political body, the institution of monarchy, would remain constant. It was like a corporation, and it could be inhabited by minors, it could be inhabited by sick people, it could be inhabited by women. And that meant that they could carry out the political role of being a monarch, despite weaknesses in their natural body. None of these explanations, of course, satisfy women today, but they were very powerful in the patriarchal society of the 16th century and beyond, indeed. Oh, one other thing I would like to mention, the picture. The reason I put this picture on is not just because it shows Knox blowing his trumpet as well as Goodman, but because both Knox and Goodman had to retract their arguments during Elizabeth's reign. Their argument, as I've said, was directed at Mary I and also Mary Queen of Scots, who was then in France, and her regent in Scotland, also a woman, Mary of Guise. All three women were Catholic. And so when a Protestant came on the throne of England, as I've said, Goodman and Knox had to retract. And this was a great propaganda coup for Catholics. And indeed, this woodcut comes at the end of a Catholic polemical work, which is basically calling Goodman and Knox a hypocrite, because it's referring in the verse that no queen in her kingdom can or ought to sit fast if Knox or Goodman's books blew any true blast. And the implication, of course, is that if they had been sincere, they would not support female rule, the rule of Elizabeth now. One of the reasons why female rule had to be, as it were, in the 16th century was because most of the females of the royal blood, the potential heirs, were all women. Most of the boys within the royal family died young. I mean, it wasn't just Edward, there were others too who might have had some kind of claim, descendants of Henry VIII's younger sister Mary, for example. But really those who were most prominent were women. From the Catholic point of view, since they had accepted Mary as a female ruler, they couldn't then go on and argue against Elizabeth as a woman. And so what they did, of course, was focus on her religion. They might use female stereotypes like Jezebel and Athaliah to criticize her, but the essential problem was her religion, not her gender. And then Protestants too, when they were thinking in terms of potential heirs of Elizabeth, of course, they accepted Elizabeth's gender, but they were thinking in terms of other women, not Mary, Queen of Scots, who the Catholics wanted, but in the early years of the reign, Catherine Grey. And if all else failed, I suppose we could say Lady Arbella Stewart. So I think the practical reason is biology, why queenship was so dominant in the 16th century and why it had to be justified. Now, in some respects, historians until recently, when I say recently, I mean last 30 or 40 years, had almost as much difficulty as contemporaries in accepting female rule. They could not escape their own gendered stereotypes. So we have Mary on the one hand, who was labeled a poor ruler, and her characteristics were all seen as female. On the other hand, Elizabeth, for the most part, was seen as manly, an unnatural woman, but she was Gloriana. And I'll take you very briefly through these because I have a lot of material to get through. Perhaps the most important label attached to Mary is that she was hysterical, and her phantom pregnancies were deemed an element of the hysteria, but so was her hostility towards Elizabeth, so was her overdependence on her husband, Philip II. Finally, the point of the barren interlude, which I've put at the bottom, her reign was identified with her body. This actually was also true in terms of how Protestants looked at Mary. But the fact that she was unable to produce an heir, she was barren, became almost a metaphor for what was described by historians as the barrenness of her reign. Nothing productive came from it. There were no reforms. The religion that she was restoring was an old form of religion. It didn't have vitality. So Elizabeth was condemned, partly at least, for her gender. On the other hand, Elizabeth's good points were associated with her gender, in particular that she was a politique in religion. It was seen that she used reason to produce a middle way, which I've criticized elsewhere, and that she was someone, therefore, who ruled wisely and could use judgment. However, there were criticisms made of Elizabeth running right the way through the historiographical tradition, indeed today, and they were associated too with her gender. So she was accused of female hesitancy. With men, I think, if it had been a man who was sort of thinking about what he was going to do and what we would call hesitant, he would be called circumspect. But for a woman, it was seen as hesitancy, something negative. And the final point about the seductive image, I just want to read a quotation to you because I think it sort of sums up attitudes, certainly in the earlier part of the 20th century, running through to the post-war period, the 1950s. And I'm not going to quote from John Neal, but I'm going to quote from Gerard Mattingly. And he said this: "There was no way Elizabeth Tudor could govern the English by force. She ruled them by the arts by which a clever woman cajoled them, or by which a clever woman, rules a lover. From the very first, she courted them, posed for them, cajoled them. It was for them she made herself beautiful and a little remote, and surrounded by a glittering court." Now, Mattingly is, of course, over the top in this, but these kinds of attitudes were held for a very long time, perhaps in a more muted form. And some of them you still see, I think, today. That being said, there have been new writings on both Mary and Elizabeth. The revisionist writings on Mary, I think the person who really began the process of this was Judith Richards. Her biography of Mary came out in 2003, but she had written many articles and essays which were leading up to her view of Mary, which I very much agree with, which is that she was a competent ruler, that she had been educated to rule, and that she showed resourcefulness at the time of the 1553 succession crisis and the 1554 rebellion known as Wyatt's Rebellion. Judith Richards also answered the criticisms of Mary, for example, that she married unwisely, and Judith points out that Philip II was a very good choice of marriage partner. And finally, she says that Mary offered an object lesson to Elizabeth. She makes this particularly clear in the collection of essays, Mary Tudor, Old and New Perspectives, which is side by side with her. The other frontispieces that I've included here are worth noting as well, in particular Sarah Duncan's 2012 book on Mary, because it has a totally gendered perspective. She uses the lens of gender to analyze ceremony, language, and iconography of the Queen and demonstrates, as had Judith Richards before her, that Mary was not the weak ruler that was so maligned by Protestant writers who were responsible for beginning her historical reputation, and nor the maligned queen that other later historians, particularly those who thought the Protestant Reformation was a good thing, the way that they directed their criticisms of her. So Mary now is appearing in a very different light in historiographical writings from the way that she would have appeared, say, in even the 1970s and 1980s. When it comes to gendered readings of Elizabeth and how her queenship has been interpreted, the leader of the pack has to be Carol Levin. In 1994, she produced The Heart and Stomach of a King, which took a very new way of looking at Elizabeth, examining the gender constructions, the role expectations, and the beliefs about sexuality that influenced Elizabeth's public persona and the way that she was perceived as a female Protestant ruler. And the book has been so successful that a second edition has been produced or printed in 2013. And for all, I think, gendered readings of Elizabeth, Carol Levin really she exemplifies those and brings them together in a way that creates very much a new Elizabeth, I think. Now, it's not just the two separate monarchs that were being given a kind of a new bolt of fresh air through gender studies. In addition, there has been an analysis of queenship in these collections of essays, which some of them are comparative and look at Mary and Elizabeth together. Some of them look at the queens individually. And I think most of them would argue for the importance of gender in queenship, particularly by looking at language, such as the tropes of humility and female weakness that Mary and Elizabeth sometimes employed, the strategies that the queens used to negotiate their gender, such as the manipulation of royal ceremonies and their iconography. Now, while accepting the importance of Mary and Elizabeth's gender on political culture, and culture in general, actually, during their reigns, I want to suggest that the Queen's gender was less significant in the politics of their reigns than many historians within this gender framework have suggested. The exercise of queenship, I'm going to argue here, was less different from kingship than has often been suggested, and that perhaps during Elizabeth's reign, even more than the Mary's reign, because I think there are perhaps some particular issues arising from her marriage, which are the result of her gender, that I shall be talking about. But as far as Elizabeth is concerned, I'm going to suggest, perhaps controversially, that her gender did not matter anything like as much as is today often assumed. One of the reasons why I think that the monarchs do not, or their gender does not really come to the fore quite as greatly as has been suggested, and why it is perhaps less significant, is because they were determined to retain the traditional prerogatives of kingship. They saw themselves and were treated as princes, holding the same prerogatives as male monarchs. Two examples I'm giving here. The first comes from the coronation portrait of Elizabeth I, where she is symbolically retaining the same prerogatives and role as a monarch. So she wears the crown of Edward the Confessor, an imperial crown. She is a holder of imperial power. She holds the orb with the cross, which is a sign both of her political power, but also her sacral power, and I'll say something more than that. And she is holding the scepter. She is the supreme judge in the state. And these are all elements that were tied up with the coronation ritual. And of course, at the coronation, Elizabeth and Mary were both anointed, which gave them that sacral power that was as important to kings as it was going to be to them. And the coronation process, the process of the ceremony was no different for Elizabeth and Mary than it was for previous kings. They didn't change it because of the gender perspective. There were some issues about whether Elizabeth should be changed at all because of her religion, but nothing was to be changed in terms of her gender. And then on the right-hand side, I refer to an act which declared that the regal power of this realm is in the Queen's Majesty as fully and absolutely as ever it was in any of her most noble progenitors, king of this realm. Now, at one level, you could say, well, the very fact that she needed to have an act of parliament stating this declares just how shaky the female rule was. You could say that, but I would argue that she wanted it to be absolutely clear and to be in legality terms as well as in ceremonial terms, that this was going to be the case, particularly as she was on the cusp of marrying, and that was going to introduce a new element into female monarchy. Now, as I've already said, these monarchs, queens, operated in a sacral sense, just as had kings. The fact that they were females did not mean that they could not carry out those sacred aspects which were carried out by kings almost as successors to Christ. So we have here the picture of Mary I blessing cramp rings, a practice that went back to the reign of Edward III. It meant that through her blessing, through the magical or mystical powers that came from her sacral kingship or queenship, she would be able to cure epilepsy and cramps for those who received the rings that she distributed and wore them. In the same way, both monarchs, it's worth mentioning here, carried out the royal touch, which was a traditional rite whereby the monarch would touch those who were ill with a disease called scrofula, which would then supposedly going to be able to cure them, or at least make them at least have the possibility of cure. And here on the right, we have a little miniature which shows Elizabeth in blue with an apron on, who is washing the feet of poor women on Maundy. Now, this was a practice that again went back to the New Testament, where Christ is washing the feet of followers. The only changes that were made to this ceremony, and it was carried out, is really what's important here. But it's worth noting that the changes that were made were that the poor women were women, not men. And that the ceremony is pretty much, not entirely, as you can see by the male figure here, and at the back here, that it's a much more strongly female space. But that doesn't alter the fact that what these two queens are doing is carrying out the rites, R-I-T-S-E-S, of sacral kingship, despite the fact that they are women. And that brings us on naturally to their role over the church. Now, Mary wanted to return, and indeed did return, England to Rome, and her role over the church, she intended to be the same as medieval kings. It's worth noting, though, that in order to do that, as has often been said, she had to carry out the role as supreme head of the church in order to dismantle the headship of the church. And it's also worth mentioning that even when the church did go back to Rome and became a Roman Catholic church, once again, royal injunctions were a way that she could intervene or set out the pattern for the Catholic Reformation that she desired within her church and that her ministers and her bishops wanted. But let's turn to Elizabeth. Much has been made of the fact that she was called Supreme Governor of the Church rather than Supreme Head, and suggestions have been made that it was because she was a woman that she thought that it would be more palatable to be a governor rather than a supreme head. Now, we don't know, but I suspect she thought it would be more palatable to Catholics if she was supreme governor rather than supreme head, that she was more concerned about bringing the Catholic bishops, particularly Archbishop Heath, who was Mary's chancellor, into the kind of Reformation fold which they might accept if she was the supreme governor rather than the supreme head of the church. Maybe Protestants thought that this was a good idea because of her gender. Maybe they thought it was a good idea because they felt that supreme head gave any monarch too much power over the church, that the supreme head of the church was in their eyes Christ, and that only governorship of the church would be possible for a secular head. We don't know, but certainly I am of the opinion that it was issues surrounding Elizabeth's hopes politically in terms of bringing in the Catholics that motivated her. Of course, she was unsuccessful. Archbishop Heath and the other bishops refused to take the oath of supremacy. Again, we're in the world of the hypotheticals, but it's my belief that they would have refused to have done it, even if Elizabeth had been a man, that their objections were not so much to a woman, though that might have enhanced their objections, but far more to the fact that by this stage, they were not going down any Henrician line of supreme headship or governorship of the church, no matter what the gender of the monarch was. Just going back, an extra point I thought of that is worth mentioning, and that is despite the governorship as opposed to the headship of the church, perhaps I should just go back here, Elizabeth behaved as if she was head of the church. It isn't just that she sent out visitations, that there were injunctions, but also that she pretty much dismissed her Archbishop of Canterbury in the mid-1570s, when Archbishop Grindal refused to obey a royal order and wrote a letter to the Queen, which in some ways challenged the notion of headship or even governorship of the church by a secular ruler. Elizabeth was so furious that she not only sequestered him, turned him out from ruling as Archbishop of Canterbury. She didn't dismiss him, in fact, though I think she'd have liked to, but she as good as did. And she would not listen to her ministers who wanted her to pardon him, even if he apologized. Elizabeth was determined that it should be made absolutely clear that she was in practice, even if her title was somewhat different, she was in practice running the church. She was its supreme head. And so we move on to the notion of chivalric monarchy. Now here, I think we do see a difference between Mary and Elizabeth. And I think the difference comes because of Mary's marriage. Let's start off with Elizabeth. I suppose the supreme chivalric role that the monarch would demonstrate, apart from going off to war, was to be the head of the Order of the Garter, which was the military order that went back again to the reign of Edward III. And the Order of the Garter was, I think I would argue, more important to Elizabeth than it was to Edward VI, the male monarch. Edward VI was very suspicious of it because of its links with St. George, and he disliked the kind of religious rituals and prayers associated with it. But Elizabeth didn't seem to mind that at all, and she certainly was keen to celebrate the Garter festivities. But just as important, there were many portraits of her where she displayed the Garter. I've only chosen one of them, and emphasized her role within this, what you might call a male cult. And she, on occasions, would distribute or give the Garter, bestow the Garter on those few males who received this highest honor in the way that she wore the Garter, by putting it over their neck. But there was at least one incident when we know she put it around the recipient's thigh. So the kind of gender dimension to this ceremony and to this very important element in chivalric monarchy does not seem to me to have much importance, if any. The Garter does change, the ceremonies do change. More of them are celebrated, for example, in Whitehall than in Windsor. There is far more a courtly dimension to the ceremonies. And again, I would think this has got as much to do with religion, playing down the more religious side to it, than it has to do with gender. But then let's just go back to Mary. Now, I haven't shown a picture of Mary in relation to chivalric monarchy because I haven't found a picture where Mary is displaying the Garter. And what it seems to me is that she is expecting Philip, her husband, to take on the role of the head of the order. And we can see this, I think, perhaps most clearly in the inventory that Philip goes through of the Queen's goods after her death. And there are numerous garters and St. George's within that. And some of them are labelled a gift from the Queen to Philip. So the Garter ceremony was important to Mary, but it was in one way in which she thought she could bring Philip in. Now, whether she was doing this because she wanted to be inclusive to Philip, who was perhaps not the most popular choice of husband, or whether it was because she thought it wasn't her role as a woman to take on this chivalric dimension to monarchy, we just don't know. But there is certainly a difference here between Elizabeth and Mary. Well, when we move from chivalry playing at the military side to real military leadership. Gender obviously does play a role here. I suppose you could argue that the queens could go out and fight. Mary Queen of Scots did when there was a rebellion. She went on horseback to try and lead the troops putting it down. But neither Mary nor Elizabeth were taking on that role. In the case of Mary, she used the Earl of Pembroke at the Battle of St. Quentin to fight with her husband's troops. And in the case of Elizabeth, as we can see from a much later picture, there is, I don't know why it says C 1560, obviously quite wrong. So apologies for that. But you can see from Elizabeth I at Tilbury that what was built up here was her speech to the troops at Tilbury, where she is trying to boost morale. Now, I want to just make 2 points. One sort of downgrades gender and one upgrades it. Downgrading gender, I think we have to remember that not all kings went out into battle, and they, either because there were no wars or because at times they thought that the presence of the monarch was not necessary. Even at the beginning of Henry VIII's reign, he chose not to join the expeditionary force when it went out to Guyenne. Henry VII, of course, didn't go into battle, though he did go over to France, admittedly at the head of what could be considered an army. So in that way, I suppose I'm downgrading the question of whether a monarch goes out and whether a queen is therefore different from a king. But on the side where I do think there is a difference, and that relates particularly to Elizabeth of Tilbury, I suspect so much about the importance of the Tilbury speech comes because she was a woman. Now, it's important to note that during her lifetime, not a great deal was made of the Tilbury speech. It was not printed. It's barely, I mean, it's mentioned that she inspects her troops, but it's not mentioned that she delivers this oration, which, along with Gettysburg, are two of the shortest, most notorious, famous orations, I think, in Western or in English spoken history. It's because of the way that she refers to her gender that it's seen as being such an important part of the morale boosting exercise of queenship during her reign. Had she been a man, I think it would have remained unnoticed after her death. Now, the dynastic responsibilities of kingship are, of course, to marry and have children. And obviously you could do the first, but it wasn't necessarily inevitable that the second would follow. And I think there is something to be said about Mary's marriage to Philip changing some of the dimensions of queenship. At one level, it didn't. Philip was not given the role as a crowned king, and he was not able to have his own men, Spaniards, on the council. His role was defined as one as a consort, and that the attempt was to limit his influence on warfare, on policy, so that there was a strong attempt by those drawing up the marriage treaty to keep Mary's queenship intact and Philip to be seen far more in a ceremonial role. And Mary certainly did give Philip the ceremonial responsibilities. And it could be argued, perhaps more than I was willing to admit when I wrote my book, Monarchy and Matrimony. I think I've shifted a bit here. I think Mary allowed Philip to share in the monarchy in a perhaps more than I had understood at the time. And I think the two, I'm going to show you just a few pictures which visually display what I mean. I just want you to note, these are legal documents, okay? And in the legal documents, in the historiated Ps, you can see the two monarchs. Now, on the left, you see an earlier version, I think it's 1554 or 1555, where Mary is on the left and Philip is on the right. They are both holding the instruments of ritualized monarchy, and they have, of course, the crown in between them. In the second one, you have Philip on the left and Mary on the right, and similarly, they are holding each an instrument of monarchy. I think it's quite interesting that Mary is looking inwards and seems to be, and Philip seems to be looking outwards, but that may just be something in my imagination. The second one is 1556. Let's just turn now to coins and seals. The seal is in the Society of Antiquaries, so that's here. But what you can see with the coin, and it's an early coin, is that, again, Mary is on the right and Philip is on the left, and you have the crown over both of them. Now, it's sometimes been said that Mary's head is higher than Philip's, but I don't actually think anyone would notice that because it depends how you hold the coin, and it's such a marginal difference. It wouldn't be obvious. Here again, we can see Philip on the left, and Philip is holding the sword of state, paralleling Mary, who's holding the scepter. It's more obvious, I think, here that she seems to be looking at him while he is looking outwards. But again, it's, that may be something I'm overemphasizing. Now, why am I giving so much importance to where they're sitting? It's because if you look at ruling kings, you find that the ruling kings are on the left-hand side and their consorts are on the right. And so if we look back at Philip, he has assumed the male position, the position of the ruling king. Now, the question I suppose we have to ask ourselves, for which there is no answer, is why did this happen and how did people respond to it? And I'm guessing that given that it's the coin as well as the seal, that it's Mary's decision alongside with her husband's. How people responded to it, we don't know. We just don't know. We don't know if they noticed it, and if they did, whether they thought that this was fairly normal or whether they were worried about the influence of a foreign king. We can say that by the end of Mary's reign, particularly after the defeat against the French and the loss of Calais, Philip has become extremely unpopular, and Mary is being seen as someone who has been dependent upon her husband and therefore has followed him into a war in which England had no interest. I'm not saying that's true. I don't think it was true. I think England did have an interest, but nevertheless, that is the way it was beginning to be seen during the end of the reign. Speedily moving on, Elizabeth, as we all know, was the Virgin Queen, and it was traditionally argued, or not traditionally, it was argued certainly through these gendered representation, that her decision to become a Virgin Queen was in order to secure power for herself. And this was very much the theme of Elizabeth the Virgin Queen, the Shekhar Kapoor film, where Elizabeth assumes the portrait, as it were, of either the Ditchley or the Armada portrait, the iconography of those portraits becomes the Virgin Queen after she has been betrayed in the film by Robert Dudley. Now, I don't take on that view. I can answer questions about it, but I don't think Elizabeth is a Virgin Queen because it's the only way she can hold on to power. One reason why, I suppose, is that she was considering, I think, really quite seriously, marriage. Robert Dudley, I think she would have liked to have married had his wife not been killed in mysterious circumstances, and had he not before that been married, and had not there been so much opposition to the marriage, a possibility of a marriage to Francis, Duke of Anjou, the Catholic younger brother of the King of France. I don't think Elizabeth wanted to marry the Archduke Charles of Austria, but the refusal of Charles to accept a marriage treaty in which he would not be allowed to have access to the Mass really brought to an end any possibility of Elizabeth accepting the terms that he was putting forward. Now, my last point that I'm going to talk about is how their iconography works. And I'm going to have to do this very quickly because I'm running out of time and I do want to answer questions. The first point I want to make is that iconographically, the two queens found it not difficult to present themselves as ruling monarchs. Here we have actually in printed work, John Fox's Acts of Martyrs, illustrating his providential theme that Elizabeth was saved by God through Mary's reign in order to destroy the Pope, who you can see with the broken keys, and to bring prosperity and true religion to England. Here we have, in a manuscript, Mary being put on the throne by two angels because she is going to restore the Catholic Church, and the wicked Duke of Northumberland is trounced in the background. The iconography of Mary in terms of the left-hand picture is based on her dynastic succession, her relationship. Here we've got the red rose that is both the red rose, of course, of the Virgin Mary, but it's also part of the Tudor rose. And in the dynastic jewel she is wearing here, Mary is presenting herself in both religious and dynastic terms. And here in John Haywood's The Spider and the Fly, there is definitely a gendered representation in that Mary can be represented as the maid who is sweeping away the Protestant spider in order to make the church and true religion strong in Protestant England. And when we come to Elizabeth's image, again, the image emerges, well, it's not again, but the image emerges throughout the reign. But again, there doesn't seem to be any difficulty in Elizabeth finding her feet in presenting herself as a queen, apart possibly from the first image, which is certainly not the best one, even though there are lots of copies of this. And I think here Elizabeth is presenting herself in her dynastic aspect, wearing the famous jewel that had belonged to her father, showing herself to be educated and pious. But then we move on to Elizabeth becoming a marriageable queen, also dynastically wearing the red and white rose, but nevertheless one that is ready to marry, moving on to the Virgin Queen and ending with the apotheosis of Elizabeth in the Armada and the Ditchley portraits as powerful icons. So again, I will just summarize very quickly. Elizabeth and Mary deal with their queenship. They present themselves as powerful rulers. They take on the prerogatives and the roles of kingship. And apart from, and I suppose some of you might think it's a very big apart from, the issue of Philip and Mary working together as monarchs, I would say we have a queenship that is comparable to kingship. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susan, for that wonderful talk, which has taken us over a huge range of the issues to do with Mary and Elizabeth and queenship. And what I'm going to try and do is I've tried to bunch some of the questions together, because there are some big themes that come across. But I should also add, as always with these lectures, what's wonderful about the chat function is that the thanks is flooding in, obviously, from many people as I look at this screen. So thanks from everyone for all that you've given us today. I think one of the themes that comes across, and several questioners have picked up on, is and what you've done so cleverly for us, is to suggest that there are ways in which Mary and Elizabeth are two sides of the same coin, without mixing up that very important, or invading that very important reference to real coinage, in that she prepares the way for Elizabeth, because, as someone suggested, she takes the sting out of, James Connolly suggested, she takes the sting out of the idea of being a female ruler, and makes the whole image of the female ruler acceptable. And what I might feed in there is that they both had contentious and different factions around them to negotiate with and deal with. I'm thinking of that idea that was put forward, I think it was an article in one of the journals, as Mary taking on the role of the Dickensian character, Mr. Jorkins. She's forever saying to the Spanish, I'd like to do these things for you, but my parliament won't allow it. Just as Elizabeth, as someone suggested, Kate Wallace talks about the fact that she has to contend with Catholic nobility, who are still quite powerful, particularly in the north, so that they both negotiate their position as queens with these contesting factions around them.
Yes, I think that's very, very interesting point, which is, again, of course, like kings, because the real problem, as you mentioned, is religion for the most part, rather than the fact that they're women, that these problems emerge. Though it's fair to say, of course, that the marriage question does come up again and again in both reigns. But one of the points that is made by others, and I entirely agree with, and here again, you could say gender is important, is that they use their gender to good effect. So sometimes you gave the example of Mrs. Dawkins, I think they were, whichever one it was, that Mary sometimes presents herself as weak. I can't do this because I'm a mere woman, they're much too strong. But other times she presents herself as very strong. So when she's being asked to leave London, when Wyatt's sort of, as it were, going to be knocking at the door, she is the king, and she is going to give the speech to hold London firm. And the same is true of Elizabeth. Sometimes she talks about herself as a mere woman. Other times she talks about herself as a strong prince. And so in many ways, it gives them an added bonus. It's difficult for a male king, because it's much harder, I think, living up to masculinity for a king, actually. It's one thing they can't say, well, I'm really rather weak. My counselors have put pressure on me, because then they're not living up to either of the roles of masculinity, their gender, or to their political role as king. Whereas both women can play that quite neatly at times when they choose to.
Yes, thank you. That really explores that issue much further. Thank you. Vanessa King wondered whether you felt, just in the chronology of Elizabeth's reign, that the gender issue becomes less important as Elizabeth passes childbearing age. That something about, you started making very important points about Elizabeth physically, her physical body, whether that influenced some of her attitudes towards the gender role she was negotiating and playing as she got older.
I think I would put it the other way around. I think her gender became more difficult as she got older. And there are two reasons for that. One is, of course, in her later years, you have the war. And it was, we see it in the writings of her the letters of people like Essex and Raleigh, that she's seen as behaving too womanly. You know, she's too timorous. She is going all out. So I could make a lot about that. And the other is, I'm afraid old women are not seen as being, you know, they have a bad press. I mean, it's probably still true now, so that she has to mask, you know, people talk about the mask of youth as if Elizabeth is vain. It's not vanity. It's about her recognition of the stereotypes associated with older women. Yes, there are some that might be considered wise, but the predominant, I think, stereotype is more about witches. And don't forget, this is the period of the witch hunt.
Yes.
So
yes.
I would say that the problems of Elizabeth's gender in both those senses, one is political, one is about iconography, are greater when she's older than when she's younger. But, you know, that's just a point of view off the top of my head that I've just thought.
Yes, thank you. Someone else raised the issue of the kind of European dimension of this, that after all, Mary's grandmother was Isabella of Castile, that there may be something about the role of queenship in, you could give us another lecture, I'm sure, and one day you could do this, but the role of queenship in Europe more generally at this time, and the power of certain female characters who rise to the top, whether they're as consorts and they have to rule for their indigent and purposeless sons, or whether they are actually by right queens in their own right. Do you think that there's a kind of, briefly, whether there's something worth saying there about Mary's perception of what's going on elsewhere?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that that's how she's being educated, through the influence of her mother, Catherine of Aragon. And I think you're absolutely right to draw attention to the fact that there are really powerful queens regent in this period. I've mentioned Mary of Guise, but in the Netherlands, there were powerful regents, and they had glittering courts that would rival a king's court.
Yes, good, certainly. Katie Marshall wonders whether, you know, and you don't mean to take the men out of the picture, but how would Elizabeth's structure of all this and identity and role playing might have been different without the power of people like Cecil and other courtiers who served her around her?
Well, Elizabeth's relationship with her men, in some cases, her gender does come into play, because she likes to dance, she likes to play games, and I think she likes to flirt. I think she, you know, there's a frivolous side to her as well as a queenly side to her. I don't think she ever does it with Cecil, but of course there are others that she does work that with, and I think it adds another dimension to kingly favor, because kings show favor. They give gifts to their special friends. Their special friends have a place in the privy chamber, but it just adds a different note. I do think there is a different tone because Elizabeth is a woman, but it doesn't, I think, alter the politics. I think that's really what I'm getting at.
Yes.
All the superficial, the icing on the cake is different. It's pink, not blue, but the cake is still made up of currants, nuts, and eggs and flour.
Yes. Okay. Yes, absolutely. And lastly, Susan, before we rest, we give you a well-earned rest. Just looking forwards, and again, something I started to think about here. Mark Allen raised in when you were doing iconography, and particularly the Philip and Mary iconography, you know, the legacy of some of these things. These royal portraits and images lasted at the royal court for into the 17th century, with the dispersal of the royal collection, and then, of course, much of it coming back under Charles II. And he was looking at images of Charles I and Henrietta Maria in the light of that. But also, I would add, there's been quite a lot of work done in recent years and thoughts made about how their legacy, the legacy of Elizabeth and Mary, passes down to the end of the Stuart period and Mary II, and Anne in particular, as a new Queen Elizabeth. She, after all, is the last sovereign who touches for the king's evil. She very much, some of her appearances, the coronation portrait of Anne is very much looks like Elizabeth's, even though it's in a different style a century later. That whether you feel that the legacy of these two queens in the Tudor period did have a lasting impact on queenship down through the ages.
I think they have different impacts. I do think, because England is Protestant, that Mary becomes the bad woman. She is the wicked queen. She is the Jezebel. And that grows. I mean, during Elizabeth's reign, they are loath to make too much of that, because after all, it's the Queen's sister. She's royalty. Elizabeth is sensitive on that point. But as time goes by, and as Tom Freeman has pointed out, Bloody Mary emerges as a term during the glorious time of the exclusion crisis and the So that's Mary. As far as Elizabeth is concerned, I mean, a lot has been written about Elizabeth in the 17th century, and I'll just make two brief points. One is, I do not think that Elizabeth is being used during the early Stuart period as a stick in which to beat them until relatively late. Only when it comes to trying to push those monarchs into war that you start getting that. I certainly don't think you get that early on in the Stuart period. But afterwards, because of the kinds of issues, it's not really so much because they're queens, so that is an element, but it's because Elizabeth stands for Protestantism. She stands for the defeat of Spain. She stands for issues that are so much in the mind's eye throughout the whole of the 16th century that she is being, as it were, resurrected. So you even get things like the Golden Speech becoming the Golden Speech, I think, during the interregnum, and being printed off. And it's not, I think, because she's a queen. I think the queen is a bonus. And I think it's, again, going back to that notion that God speaks through unlikely sources. If you read the Old Testament, it's so important in the book of Judges, for example. And that, therefore, we have to remember Solomon, of course, wasn't the oldest son either. So I think I think Elizabeth she stands for that. Her gender stands for that it is extraordinary. And it shows, in a sense, God's favor that we have our own, as it were, King Solomon or King David, and that's where her gender really cries out to people of the time who are facing the same sorts of issues, they think, as were relevant in Elizabeth's reign.
Thank you, Susan. That's a very powerful point with which I think to end all this wonderful time you've given us today, and to thank you again for your perceptive ideas about how we think about Mary and Elizabeth in the light of particularly the religious dimension, which we're celebrating in the exhibition on Henry VIII at this moment. If I may, to all our audience, just conclude with a few invitations to things at the Society of Antiquaries. Our next public lecture is on Tuesday, the 5th of October at 1 o'clock, Fighting Caesar, Britons in Gaul and Gauls in Britain in Caesar's Battle for Gaul. And that's by Andrew Fitzpatrick, one of our fellows. This will take place for real in the Society's apartments, as well as online. If you would like to attend in person, please book through the website of the Society. The Society is holding an early careers conference for younger academics on the 9th of October, organized by Dr. Laura Flanagan, Jen Caddick and Murray Tremellon. And you can see details of that on the website. There will be online places and an in-person attendance available. All our events are obviously on the Society's website, and I would urge you, if you haven't already, to sign up to Salon, S-A-L-O-N, our fortnightly e-newsletter, because there it will give you Society events and other events going on around the country, and news in general, and debates going on in the heritage sector. And with that, and a big thank you to Susan, thank you all for attending today, and we look forward to welcoming you at the Society in person and online many times in the future.